The roses were supposed to be perfect. 214 of them to be exact, one for every month we had been together since our first date at that little jazz bar in downtown Chicago. I had spent 3 weeks coordinating with the florist, the restaurant, the string quartet, the hotel suite overlooking Lake Michigan. I had the Cartier bracelet hidden in my sock drawer, the one she had been hinting about for the past year, the one that cost me 2 months of salary and a significant dip into my savings. I had written her a letter, 12 pages long, documenting every moment I had fallen deeper in love with her over the past 17 years of knowing each other and 7 years of marriage. I was planning the perfect Valentine's Day because I believed, with every fiber of my being, that I had the perfect wife. That was before I found the other phone. My name is Marcus, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a jealous man. I am not possessive or controlling. I trusted my wife completely, absolutely, without reservation. Victoria was my high school sweetheart, my college confidant, my partner through every struggle and triumph of my adult life. We had built everything together from nothing, from 2 kids with big dreams to successful professionals with a beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park. I never once checked her phone, never questioned her late nights at work, never doubted her when she said a client meeting ran long. I believed in us the way some people believe in gravity. It was just there, constant and unshakable. I was wrong. I was so devastatingly, humiliatingly wrong. It was February 10th, 4 days before Valentine's Day, and I had come home early from a site visit to surprise her with lunch. The house was quiet, which was unusual for a Tuesday afternoon, but I figured she was at a client consultation. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes and maybe grab that letter I had been working on, thinking I might add a few more paragraphs. That is when I heard it, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating from somewhere in our bedroom. At first, I thought nothing of it. Victoria was always misplacing her phone around the house. But when I followed the sound, it led me to her closet, to a shoebox on the top shelf behind her winter sweaters, a place where she kept things she did not want easily found. The box was labeled with the name of a shoe brand she did not even wear. My heart was pounding as I reached for it, though I could not explain why. Some part of me knew. Some primal instinct was screaming at me to stop, to put the box back, to preserve the beautiful lie of my life for just a little longer. I opened it anyway. Inside was a phone I had never seen before, a sleek, expensive model that was definitely not hers. When I picked it up, the screen lit up with a text message notification. The contact name was saved simply as R with a heart emoji beside it. The message itself was short, devastating, and impossible to misunderstand. It said, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear the red one. I'll have the room ready." I stood there, holding that phone in my hands, feeling like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. The world was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago, and yet everything was different. Everything was ruined. I scrolled through the messages with shaking fingers, each one a hammer blow to my chest. Months of conversations, intimate exchanges, plans made and kept, photographs I cannot unsee no matter how hard I try to erase them from my memory. My wife was having an affair. My Victoria, my partner, my supposed soulmate, had been lying to me for what appeared to be at least 8 months. And the man she was seeing, this mysterious R, was clearly someone with money and resources that made my carefully planned Valentine's surprise look like a child's attempt at romance. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. I repositioned the sweaters, closed the closet door, and walked downstairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals and conversations and dreams, and I stared at the wall for what felt like hours. The lunch I had brought grew cold beside me. The letter in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. When Victoria came home that evening, she kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day with the same warm smile she always had. She told me about a difficult client who could not decide between 2 different marble countertops. She laughed about something her assistant had said at the office. She was the same woman I had loved for 17 years, and she was a complete stranger wearing her face. I did not confront her that night. I know that might seem strange, maybe even weak, but I needed time to think. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. In my work as an architect, I have learned that rushing leads to structural failures. You have to understand the foundation before you can address the cracks. And the foundation of my marriage, I was beginning to realize, was built on sand. Over the next 48 hours, I became someone I did not recognize. I became an investigator, a detective in my own home, carefully piecing together the evidence of my wife's betrayal, while maintaining a facade of normalcy that required every ounce of strength I possessed. I checked her credit card statements and found charges at hotels I had never heard of, restaurants in neighborhoods she had no reason to visit. I logged into our shared cloud account and found calendar entries that did not match what she had told me about her schedule. I even drove past her office one evening when she said she was working late and found her car absent from the parking garage. Each discovery was another wound, another confirmation that the life I thought I was living was an elaborate fiction. But I also began to find patterns, clues that would help me understand not just the affair, but the man she was having it with. The hotels were expensive, the kind that charge $500 a night for a standard room. The restaurants were exclusive establishments where reservations required connections or significant wealth. Whoever this R was, he had resources that far exceeded mine. It was my brother Derek who finally helped me put the pieces together. Derek and I had always been close, the kind of brothers who actually talked about things beyond sports and work. He had never been Victoria's biggest fan, though he had always been polite about it. He said something once years ago about how she seemed to care a lot about appearances, about status, about things that did not really matter. I had dismissed it as older brother protectiveness. Now I wondered if he had seen something I had been too blinded by love to notice. I called Derek on the night of February 12th, 2 days before Valentine's Day, and told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished. Then he said something that changed the entire trajectory of my response. He asked if I had ever heard of a developer named Ryan Holloway. The name hit me like a physical blow. Ryan Holloway was one of the biggest names in Chicago real estate, a man whose projects dominated the skyline and whose personal life was regularly featured in society pages. He was also, I suddenly remembered, someone Victoria had mentioned meeting at a networking event about 9 months ago. She had described him as interesting and well-connected, and had suggested I might want to cultivate a professional relationship with him for potential architecture contracts. I had been too busy with my own projects to follow up. Now I understood why she had made that suggestion. She was not trying to help my career. She was creating a cover story, a plausible explanation for why his name might appear in our conversations, why she might need to meet with him for professional reasons. The manipulation was elegant, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Derek did some digging over the next day, using contacts he had in the real estate world from his work as a commercial insurance broker. What he found made me sick to my stomach. Ryan Holloway was not just wealthy, he was notorious. He had a reputation for pursuing married women, treating them like conquests, showering them with gifts and attention until he grew bored and moved on to the next target. There were whispered stories about broken marriages in his wake, about women who had given up everything for him only to find themselves discarded when the novelty wore off. Victoria, I realized, was not special to him. She was a trophy, a game, a temporary amusement for a man who had everything and valued nothing. And she had risked our entire life together, 17 years of history and love and shared dreams, for someone who would forget her name within a year of ending things. The anger that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not hot and explosive. It was cold, precise, and absolutely focused. I had been wounded, humiliated, betrayed by the person I trusted most in this world. And I was not going to let either of them walk away from this unscathed. But revenge, real revenge, requires patience. It requires planning. It requires understanding your opponents well enough to know exactly where they are vulnerable. I was not going to confront Victoria with accusations that she could deny or explain away. I was not going to give Ryan Holloway the satisfaction of seeing me as the cuckolded husband making a scene. I was going to dismantle them both, systematically and thoroughly, and I was going to do it in a way that protected everything I had worked for while exposing exactly who they really were. Valentine's Day arrived, and I executed my original plan flawlessly. The roses, the restaurant, the string quartet, the hotel suite. Victoria was radiant that evening, accepting my gestures of love with the same grace she always showed. She cried when I gave her the Cartier bracelet, told me I was the most thoughtful husband in the world, held my hand across the candlelit table and talked about our future. She spoke about maybe starting a family this year, about taking that trip to Italy we had always dreamed about growing old together. Every word was a lie, and I smiled through all of it. What Victoria did not know was that I had spent the previous 2 days consulting with the best divorce attorney in Chicago. What she did not know was that I had begun documenting everything, building a case that would protect my assets and expose her infidelity in the most damaging way possible. What she did not know was that the beautiful Valentine's evening I had created was not a celebration of our love. It was the last act of a play that was about to have a very different ending than she expected. The affair continued after Valentine's Day, of course. Victoria and Ryan were apparently emboldened by the success of their deception, meeting more frequently, taking greater risks. I tracked it all, carefully and methodically, building a timeline of betrayal that stretched back nearly a year. I discovered that Ryan had bought her jewelry, expensive pieces that she kept hidden in a safety deposit box I never knew she had. I found receipts for lingerie purchased for encounters that had nothing to do with me. I uncovered text messages that detailed not just the physical aspect of their relationship, but also their plans for the future. Plans that explicitly included my removal from Victoria's life once she had secured the most favorable divorce settlement possible. That was the detail that hurt the most, somehow. Not the affair itself, not the intimacy she had shared with another man, but the cold calculation of it all. Victoria was not a woman swept away by passion, making foolish choices in the heat of the moment. She was a strategist, carefully positioning herself to maximize her financial outcome while maintaining the comfortable lifestyle I provided until she was ready to make her move. She and Ryan had discussed it explicitly in their messages. He would set her up in one of his properties, give her a position at his development company that would justify her sudden wealth, and she would walk away from our marriage with half of everything I had built, plus the secret assets she had accumulated during the affair. I had been a placeholder, a stepping stone, a source of stability while she positioned herself for an upgrade. The woman I loved had never really existed. She was a performance, a character Victoria played to get what she wanted from life, and I had been foolish enough to believe every line. The next phase of my plan required me to become someone I had never been before. I had to maintain the illusion of the trusting husband while simultaneously preparing for war. I continued to smile at Victoria over breakfast, to kiss her goodnight, to discuss weekend plans as if nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I was meeting with financial advisors to untangle our shared assets and identify what I could protect. I was consulting with a private investigator who could document the affair in ways that would be admissible in court. I was building relationships with people in Ryan Holloway's professional orbit who might become useful when the time came. The private investigator, a former police detective named Frank Chen, proved invaluable. Within 2 weeks, he had provided me with photographs, videos, hotel records, and financial transactions that painted an undeniable picture of Victoria's infidelity. But Frank also uncovered something unexpected, something that would prove far more valuable than simple evidence of an affair. He discovered that Ryan Holloway's business practices were not entirely legitimate. It started with a tip from one of Frank's contacts in the city planning department. There were irregularities in the permits for several of Holloway's recent developments, suggestions that inspections had been falsified, and that safety standards had been compromised to save money and accelerate construction timelines. The buildings looked impressive on the outside, but the infrastructure was substandard, potentially dangerous. And the documentation that would prove these violations existed in files that Ryan kept in his private office, files that he was very careful to keep separate from his company's official records. I am an architect. I understand building codes and safety standards better than most people alive. When Frank showed me what he had found, I immediately grasped the significance. Ryan Holloway was not just an arrogant rich man who stole other people's wives. He was a criminal who was putting lives at risk to increase his profit margins. And he had been getting away with it because he had money, connections, and a carefully cultivated public image that made people reluctant to challenge him. Victoria had chosen this man over me. She had looked at Ryan Holloway, knowing or at least suspecting the kind of person he really was, and decided that his wealth and status were worth more than our marriage, our history, our future. The revelation did not make me angrier at her. If anything, it clarified something I had been struggling to accept. Victoria was not a good person who had made a bad choice. She was someone whose values had always been fundamentally incompatible with mine. I had just been too in love to see it. The next month was one of the most difficult of my life. I had to maintain my facade while processing grief, anger, and the logistical complexity of what I was planning. There were nights when I lay beside Victoria in our bed, listening to her breathe, wondering how I had shared my life with someone who was capable of such calculated betrayal. There were moments when I almost broke, when the weight of pretending became too heavy, and I wanted to scream the truth at her just to see her face change. But I held on. I stayed focused. I remembered that the best revenge is not explosive and immediate. It is thorough and devastating. By mid-March, I had everything I needed. The divorce attorney had prepared documents that would protect my assets and expose Victoria's infidelity in the most legally advantageous way. Frank Chen had compiled a dossier on Ryan Holloway's business practices that would be of great interest to both city regulators and investigative journalists. I had quietly moved important personal items to a storage unit Victoria did not know about. I had documented every lie she had told me over the past year, creating a timeline that would be devastating if it ever became public. But I also had something else. Through Derek's network, I had made contact with several of Ryan Holloway's former employees, people who had witnessed his unethical practices firsthand and were bitter about how they had been treated when they raised concerns. One of them, a structural engineer named Patricia Okonkwo, had kept copies of the falsified inspection reports because she feared she might need them someday to protect herself from liability. She had been fired for asking too many questions, and she was more than willing to share what she knew if it meant holding Ryan accountable. The plan I developed was multi-pronged. I would not simply confront Victoria and file for divorce. I would orchestrate a cascade of consequences that would expose both of them simultaneously, ensuring that their scheme to profit from my destruction would instead destroy them. It was ambitious, perhaps even risky, but I had nothing left to lose except a marriage that was already dead. I might as well use that freedom to ensure that justice was served. The first move happened on a Friday afternoon in late March. I had timed it carefully to coincide with a major press event for one of Ryan's flagship developments, a luxury condominium project that was his pride and joy. While he was schmoozing with investors and journalists, celebrating the success of his latest venture, a package was delivered to the offices of the Chicago Tribune's investigative journalism team. The package contained Patricia Okonkwo's documents, Frank Chen's findings, and a detailed analysis I had prepared showing exactly how Ryan's cost-cutting measures had compromised structural integrity in multiple buildings. The journalist who received the package was someone I had researched carefully. Stephanie Morrison was known for her tenacity, her ethical standards, and her particular interest in stories about wealthy men who abused their power. She had exposed corruption in city government and corporate malfeasance in the past. She would not be intimidated by Ryan Holloway's money or connections, and she would not rest until she had verified every claim and pursued every lead. The second move happened later that same evening. Victoria had told me she was attending a gallery opening with clients, which I knew from Frank's surveillance was actually a cover for a weekend rendezvous with Ryan at his Lake Geneva property. While she was packing her overnight bag, believing I was at a work dinner, I was actually meeting with my divorce attorney to finalize the paperwork that would be served the following Monday. I had made some strategic decisions about how to handle the divorce. Rather than seeking a public trial that would air all our dirty laundry, I had opted for an approach that would be more targeted in its consequences. The evidence of Victoria's affair would be presented privately to her attorney, making it clear that a prolonged fight would only result in more damaging revelations. The documentation of her hidden assets, including the safety deposit box and the accounts that Ryan had opened in her name, would be used to ensure that she could not claim a larger share of our marital property. And the timeline of her deception, showing that she had been planning to leave me for months while continuing to enjoy the lifestyle I provided, would be leveraged to minimize any alimony claims. But here is where I made a choice that surprised even me. I did not want Victoria financially destroyed. Despite everything, I found that I could not reduce the woman I had loved for 17 years to complete ruin, even though she had been willing to do exactly that to me. What I wanted was accountability. I wanted her to face the consequences of her choices, to lose the comfortable certainty that she could manipulate and deceive without penalty. I wanted her to know that I had seen through her performance and that the script she had written for our ending had been completely rewritten. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness. Victoria returned from her supposed gallery opening glowing with satisfaction, probably from 2 days in Ryan's arms. She told me elaborate lies about the art she had seen, the conversations she had had, the new clients she had potentially acquired. I nodded and smiled and asked appropriate questions, all while knowing that the world was about to shift beneath her feet. Monday morning, I went to work as usual. I kissed Victoria goodbye, told her I would be late because of a site inspection, and walked out of our brownstone for what I knew would be one of the last times as its co-owner. At precisely 10 o'clock, a process server appeared at Victoria's office and handed her the divorce papers. I was not there to see her face, but I had asked my attorney to inform me when it was done. The documents were comprehensive. They outlined the evidence of her affair with Ryan Holloway, complete with selected photographs and financial records. They detailed the hidden assets she had accumulated, demanding their disclosure and division. They cited the applicable Illinois laws regarding infidelity and its impact on divorce proceedings. And they made it absolutely clear that any attempt to contest these terms would result in the full dossier being entered into the public record, where it would become available to anyone who cared to look. Victoria called me 17 times that afternoon. I did not answer. She sent dozens of text messages, ranging from confused to angry to desperate to pleading. I did not respond. Instead, I checked into a hotel near my office and waited for the other shoe to drop. It dropped the following morning, when Stephanie Morrison's preliminary story broke. The Tribune ran a front-page investigation into Ryan Holloway's construction practices, citing the falsified inspections, the compromised safety standards, and the multiple buildings that required immediate engineering assessment. The city suspended permits for all of his active projects pending investigation. His investors demanded emergency meetings. His board of directors called an extraordinary session, and his carefully cultivated public image began to crumble as former employees came forward with their own stories of intimidation and ethical violations. Ryan Holloway, the man Victoria had chosen over me, was suddenly fighting for his professional survival. The fortune she had expected to share was evaporating before her eyes. The future they had planned was collapsing, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. I learned later, through various sources, what happened between Victoria and Ryan in the days following the exposure. Their relationship, which had been built on the promise of wealth and status, could not survive the sudden absence of both. Ryan blamed Victoria for somehow being connected to his downfall, probably noticing the timing of my divorce filing and his public exposure. Victoria blamed Ryan for dragging her into a scandal that destroyed her own professional reputation. They turned on each other with the same cold calculation they had used to betray me, each trying to minimize their own damage at the other's expense. Victoria reached out to me a week later, not through attorneys, but through a personal email that she must have composed after considerable reflection. She admitted the affair. She apologized for the deception. She tried to explain in terms that I found unconvincing that she had been seduced by Ryan's attention and wealth, that she had never stopped loving me, that she had made a terrible mistake and wanted a chance to make things right. I did not respond to that email. There was nothing to say. The woman who had written it was a stranger, someone I had never really known despite the years we had spent together. Her apologies and explanations were just more performance, another script designed to achieve a desired outcome. She had lost her advantage and was now trying to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage. I refused to give her the opportunity. The divorce proceedings continued over the next several months. Victoria's attorney initially tried to fight the terms I had proposed, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the threat of public exposure was effective. In the end, Victoria received far less than she had expected. The hidden assets were factored into the division, reducing her share of our marital property. Her claim to alimony was denied based on the documentation of her plans to leave me for a wealthier man. She got to keep some furniture, some personal belongings, and a modest settlement that would require her to actually work for a living rather than coast on someone else's success. Ryan Holloway's fall was more dramatic and more public. The investigation into his construction practices led to criminal charges, including fraud and reckless endangerment. Several of his buildings were condemned as unsafe, requiring extensive and expensive remediation. His development company filed for bankruptcy protection. His investors sued him for millions. And his social status, which had been his armor against accountability for years, dissolved as former friends and associates distanced themselves from the scandal. He tried to fight back, of course. Men like Ryan Holloway do not go quietly. He hired expensive lawyers and public relations firms, tried to spin the story in his favor, attempted to discredit the witnesses who had come forward against him. But the evidence was too solid, the documentation too thorough. Patricia Okonkwo testified at his preliminary hearing with quiet dignity, explaining exactly how he had pressured her to falsify reports and then fired her when she refused. Frank Chen's investigation was corroborated by city officials who had been waiting for someone else to make the first move, and Stephanie Morrison continued to dig, uncovering additional violations and victims that made Ryan's position increasingly untenable. In the end, Ryan Holloway pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for avoiding trial. He received a significant fine, a suspended sentence, and permanent prohibition from working in construction or real estate in the state of Illinois. The empire he had built was gone. The reputation he had cultivated was destroyed, and the woman he had been using as his latest conquest had already moved on, probably to her next target. I saw Victoria once more, about a year after our divorce was finalized. She was at a restaurant downtown with a man I did not recognize, someone who appeared to be wealthy and attentive. She did not notice me, or at least she pretended not to. I watched her for a moment, this woman who had once been the center of my world, and I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not jealousy, not even satisfaction at how things had turned out. Just a strange, detached clarity. Victoria was exactly who she had always been. I had simply chosen not to see it. The signs had been there from the beginning, in her obsession with appearances and status, in the way she had pushed me to take higher-paying jobs even when I was happy with my work, in her subtle disappointment when our lifestyle did not match her expectations. I had explained away these traits, reframed them as ambition and drive, because I wanted to believe in the version of her that matched my dreams. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been clarifying. It forced me to see the truth about my marriage and about myself. I had been so invested in the idea of Victoria, in the story I had told myself about our love, that I had ignored reality for years. I had made myself blind, and she had exploited that blindness ruthlessly. But here's the thing about having your illusions shattered. Once you can see clearly, you can never go back to the comfortable fog. I emerged from that experience changed, harder in some ways, but also more authentic. I knew what I valued now, what I would not compromise on, what I deserved from a partner. I knew how to trust, but also how to verify. I knew that love was not enough if it was not built on genuine respect and shared integrity. The years since have been good ones. I threw myself into my work with a new sense of purpose, designing buildings that would actually serve the people who used them rather than just impressing investors. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my marriage, people who had seen through Victoria long before I did and had quietly waited for me to catch up. I started seeing a therapist who helped me process the grief and anger and understand the patterns that had led me to choose someone so fundamentally wrong for me. And eventually, gradually, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of love again. I met someone new, a woman named Elena, who was nothing like Victoria in any way that mattered. She was honest to the point of bluntness, completely uninterested in status or appearances, passionate about her work as a pediatric nurse, and entirely incapable of the kind of calculated manipulation that had characterized my marriage. We took things slowly, building trust through accumulated evidence rather than blind faith, and what we have now feels more real and solid than anything I experienced with Victoria. I still think about that Valentine's Day sometimes. The roses, the restaurant, the string quartet, the bracelet, all that effort to celebrate a love that was already dead, killed by someone I trusted absolutely. It was the last day of my old life, the final act of a performance I had not realized I was part of. And in a strange way, I am grateful for it. Not for the pain it caused, but for the awakening that followed. If you are watching this and recognizing something in my story, if you are seeing parallels in your own relationship, I want to tell you something important. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is. The excuses we make for the people we love are often just lies we tell ourselves to avoid painful truths. And the longer we stay in denial, the more power we give to those who would exploit our devotion. But I also want to tell you that survival is possible. Recovery is possible. Even after the worst betrayal, after your entire world has been revealed as an illusion, you can find solid ground again. It takes time, and it takes work, and it takes a willingness to be honest with yourself about how you got there in the first place. But the person you become on the other side of that journey is stronger, wiser, and more capable of building something real. Victoria is still out there somewhere, probably charming another victim, probably spinning the story of our marriage as something other than what it actually was. Ryan Holloway is rebuilding from his ruins, no doubt planning some new scheme that will eventually collapse like all his others. They are who they are. They will always be who they are. But I am no longer their victim. I am no longer the trusting fool who believed that love could conquer fundamental incompatibilities. I am someone who learned the hardest possible lesson about the difference between performance and reality, and who used that lesson to construct a life that is actually worth living. The revenge I took was not about destroying them, though destruction certainly followed. It was about protecting myself and creating consequences for choices that would otherwise have gone unpunished. It was about refusing to be a passive participant in my own betrayal. It was about standing up and saying that what they did was wrong, and that wrong actions have repercussions. Justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet and methodical, a careful dismantling of lies and facades until only the truth remains. Sometimes it is simply a matter of letting people reap what they have sown, stepping aside so the natural consequences of their choices can reach them. And sometimes, when the system fails and the powerful seem untouchable, justice requires ordinary people to become extraordinary in their pursuit of what is right. I was planning the perfect Valentine's Day. Instead, I discovered the perfect betrayal. But from the ruins of that betrayal, I built something better. A life based on truth rather than fantasy. Relationships based on genuine connection rather than performance. A sense of self that no one can manipulate because it is anchored in reality rather than illusion. That is my story. That is how I went from a man planning roses in restaurants to a man dismantling a marriage and exposing a criminal. All because I found a phone in a shoebox that was never meant to be discovered. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And it was also, in a strange and painful way, the best. The truth set me free. It took everything I thought I had, but it gave me something more valuable in return. It gave me myself back, and no betrayal, no matter how devastating, can ever take that away again. I think about that sometimes, when I am with Elena, when I am working on a project I care about, when I am simply living a life that feels authentic in a way my marriage never did. I think about how close I came to never knowing, to spending decades in a relationship built on sand, to being blindsided eventually by a woman who was just waiting for a better offer. The discovery of that phone was devastating, but it was also a gift. It was reality breaking through the illusion, truth demanding to be acknowledged even when everything in me wanted to look away. If I had found that phone even a day later, Victoria might have been gone. She and Ryan might have executed their plan, leaving me not just betrayed but also financially devastated and completely unprepared. The timing was almost miraculous, a cosmic intervention that gave me the chance to respond rather than simply react. And I seized that chance with everything I had. The consequences I orchestrated were severe, but they were also earned. Victoria lost the comfortable life she had taken for granted. Ryan lost the empire he had built on corruption and exploitation. And I, despite losing a marriage I had treasured, found something more valuable. I found the truth about who I was sharing my life with, and I found the strength to demand better for myself. That is the real revenge, ultimately. Not the financial penalties or the public exposure or the criminal charges. The real revenge is thriving. It is building a life so genuine and fulfilling that the betrayal becomes a footnote rather than a defining tragedy. It is proving, through the simple act of living well, that what they tried to take from you was never really in their power to destroy. I am Marcus Thompson. I was married to a woman I thought I knew for 7 years. I discovered she had been planning to destroy me while I was planning to celebrate our love. And instead of being destroyed, I became someone stronger, someone wiser, someone capable of genuine happiness built on an unshakable foundation of truth. That is what happens when you refuse to be a victim. That is what happens when you demand justice instead of accepting defeat. That is what happens when you take the worst thing that ever happened to you and transform it into the catalyst for the best life you have ever lived. Valentine's Day is coming around again soon. Elena and I are planning something quiet this year. Maybe dinner at home and a good movie. Nothing elaborate, nothing performative. Just two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company spending time together. It is so different from those years of grand gestures and hidden betrayal that it almost feels like a different holiday entirely. And maybe it is. Maybe this is what Valentine's Day was always supposed to be, before I let myself believe that love required spectacle and sacrifice. Maybe the simple pleasure of being with someone trustworthy is more romantic than 200 roses ever could be. I will never know what would have happened if I had not found that phone. Maybe Victoria would have left me that spring as she and Ryan had planned. Maybe I would have discovered the truth some other way, later and more painfully. Maybe I would have spent the rest of my life in that illusion, never knowing what was being taken from me. But I did find it. I did discover the truth. And I used that truth to reclaim my life from people who had never deserved to be part of it. That is my story. That is my warning and my encouragement to anyone who sees themselves in these words. Trust but verify. Love but remain clear-eyed. And if you discover that you have been betrayed, do not despair. Gather your evidence, consult your allies, plan your response carefully, and then execute it with the cold precision of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The truth always comes out eventually. The only question is whether you control its emergence or whether it controls you. I chose to take control, and that choice saved my life in every way that matters. I was planning the perfect Valentine's Day. I found out the truth instead. And in the end, the truth was the only gift worth having.